Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. We're thrilled to be here with you all on International Human Rights Day to talk about claiming the right to housing and the rights of persons with disabilities to community inclusion. Before we dive in, we're going to cover off a few logistics. To access French translation, please click the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen titled Language and click French, and the French translation should then be heard. We're offering closed captioning. Please click on the closed captioning button at the bottom of your screen. We're also offering American Sign Language interpretation, and for people following along, our ASL interpreter will be pinned to the top of your screen. If you have any questions about interpretation, please don't hesitate to type them in the comment box. And in terms of substantive questions about the presentations today, we're going to ask people to please type the questions that they have into the comment box, and we'll address them at the end of the discussion.
Pour écouter à la présentation en français, il y a un bouton sous l'écran qui s'appelle Interprétation et vous avez besoin de sélectionner l'option de French pour écouter à la webinaire en français. Merci.
This event today is co-hosted by the National Right to Housing Network, the Centre for Equality, Rights and Accommodation, and the Council of Canadians with Disabilities. We're going to take a few moments to introduce each organization, starting with the National Right to Housing Network.
Hi, everybody. My name is Michelle Biss, and I am with the National Right to Housing Network. It's a pleasure to be a part of this webinar today. A number of you might be very familiar with the work of the National Right to Housing Network, but for those who aren't, we are a group of over 300 individuals and organizations who are committed to the meaningful implementation of the right to housing in Canada, as was recognized in the National Housing Strategy Act passed in June of 2019. And I will pass it on to Alyssa.
Thank you, Michelle. My name is Alyssa Brierly. I'm the Executive Director of CERA, the Centre for Equality, Rights and Accommodation. I'm very happy to be here with you all today. And for those of you who don't know CERA, we're one of Canada's oldest nonprofit organizations working to advance the right to housing in Canada. And we do that by helping individuals facing eviction or a human rights violation in their housing by delivering education and capacity building so that people know their rights and how to assert them. And we also work to advance systemic policy change to try to make sure that our housing policy reflects the right to housing and a rights-based approach.
And Jewel, would you like to introduce the Council of Canadians with Disabilities?
Sure, sorry. I'm filling in for Tracy today, so it's a little off my normal notes here. Council of Canadians with Disabilities has a long history, over 40 years of advocating for people with disabilities rights in Canada. We've worked long and hard for deinstitutionalization of people with disabilities, having people with disabilities living in accessible and affordable housing in their own local communities or the community of their choosing. And we've also fought long and hard for the adequate disability-related supports, self-management options, and for people with disabilities who need supports to be able to live independently. We have a history of engaging in international human rights, the CRPD, as well as for rights of women with disabilities related to CEDAW in New York. Further, we have done an extensive amount of research, a number of litigations, and have just continued to push the government to address inequalities for people with disabilities related to housing and the supports. And despite 40 years of advocacy by CCD and many other organizations, as some of our colleagues have mentioned, we continue to face barriers for these rights for people. Thanks.
Excellent. So before we get started in the content, and I will say we have a pretty incredible lineup of panelists and discussion here today. It's important that we acknowledge the land that we are on. We are coming to you across Turtle Island. So I will start by naming where I am coming in from. I would like to acknowledge that I am currently on the land of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and the Haldimand Treaty. I'd also like to offer my sincere respect to our Métis and Inuit neighbors as we strive to strengthen our relationships across Turtle Island. With that, I will pass it off to Alyssa to acknowledge where she's from.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm joining the call today from Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed by the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to work on this land.
Thank you, Alyssa. Before I start my comments, I'm going to put Jewel completely on the spot and see if she wants to add in a land acknowledgement as well.
Sure. I'm currently coming from the unceded territory of the Coquitlam First Nations in what is now called British Columbia. Thanks.
Thank you, Jewel. Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being part of this webinar. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the right to housing in Canada and the rights of persons with disabilities. I think it's particularly appropriate that today is Human Rights Day. And Human Rights Day, as many know, is a celebration of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was, of course, signed many decades ago, but it was signed at a time when the rights of persons with disabilities were not highly regarded, nor were the rights of LGBTQ2S+ persons. But it does date back to a time when economic and social rights and civil and political rights, like the right to vote, were included on the same level as economic and social rights. And the Universal Declaration does provide this architecture of rights that's really important in Canada, particularly in terms of the equal importance of economic and social rights like the right to housing. Now, many decades have passed since the Declaration was signed. We now have international covenants, including the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. But it is important to remember that while Canada has ratified both civil and political and economic and social rights, it has constantly neglected economic and social rights like the right to housing. But in June of 2019, many of us in civil society celebrated when we saw the National Housing Strategy Act be adopted in June of 2019 as the first federal legislation to explicitly recognize and commit to the implementation of the right to housing under the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Now, for those of you who are new to the National Housing Strategy Act, it's also really interesting to note that the NHSA recognizes that the right to an adequate housing is a fundamental human right as affirmed under international law. And it commits the government to the progressive realization of the right to adequate housing as it is recognized in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So what that really fundamentally means is that this government has committed to realizing the right to housing as it is understood in international law. So all this to say, what does the right to housing mean under international law, and what does it mean for persons with disabilities? Well, one thing that is really clear internationally is that the right to housing does mean access to a housing unit. That's a really, really critical component, but it also goes even farther than that. Under international law, the right to housing is defined as a right to a place to live in security and dignity. And for persons with disabilities, the right to housing importantly includes the right to fully accessible housing and the right to live independently and the right to be included in community with social supports. So we are very much hoping that today's discussion will be the very beginning, or not the very beginning, perhaps a continuation of a concerted effort within our organizations, certainly within the National Right to Housing Network, to ensure that the government's commitment to the right to housing in the National Housing Strategy Act is fully recognized for persons with disabilities. in all of its dimensions. Now, for those of you who are part of the Right to Housing Network, and perhaps those of you who are part of CERA or CCD, you might know, there are some really important components of the right to housing that were included in the National Housing Strategy Act. So, for example, the government is in the process of creating a housing council. That National Housing Council will have the opportunity to review the National Housing Strategy and find the ways that it can uphold the international human rights commitments of Canada in relationship to the right to housing. And it will also have the opportunity to put together a review panel made up of 3 members of the National Housing Council who will be able to review systemic issues related to the right to housing as they're referred by the Federal Housing Advocate. The Federal Housing Advocate is supported by an office within the Canadian Human Rights Commission, and they will be engaging with vulnerable and marginalized communities, receiving submissions, submitting findings, and making recommendations to the government, and to refer important issues to that review panel. So we will soon see all 3 of these components, the National Housing Council, the review panel, and the advocate, all working together in order to find ways to implement the right to housing. But of course, it's incredibly important that the rights of persons with disabilities and persons with disabilities who have a first voice are meaningfully included throughout the creation of all of these mechanisms. Now, these mechanisms, the National Housing Council and the Federal Housing Advocate, the review panel, are all just now being put in place. I'm happy to report that 12 exceptional members of the National Housing Council have now been appointed, and we are expecting that 4 more appointments will come to ensure that there are members with lived experience of homelessness and persons with real technical expertise in the right to housing as it's required in the legislation. I will also note for those who are joining this session that the government is currently looking for candidates for the Federal Housing Advocate to shape this brand new human rights mechanism. If you are a human rights passionate person who is really interested in shaping this very first economic and social rights mechanism, we urge you to put your name forward for the role of the Federal Housing Advocate. But of course, these human rights systems will only work if civil society, affected communities, persons with lived experience come together and claim their rights based and make effective submissions on systemic issues to the Housing Advocate and the review panel. And it's particularly important that systemic issues faced by persons with disabilities, such as widespread homelessness, lack of community support, and failure to ensure accessible design are critically addressed. And we really hope that this discussion today will start that important process. We have much discussion throughout the day, throughout the next hour and a half, from folks who are claiming the right to housing in ways all across the country as we await the creation of the Federal Housing Advocate and Council. And we hope that this discussion will start spurring more and more work as we figure out ways to use the right to housing as it's established through the National Housing Strategy Act, and also find all the ways that we can collaborate together to make the right to housing real in collaboration with persons with disabilities. So with that, I will pass the mic over to Jules, who I believe is giving some further background.
Thank you. Am I giving background? Sorry. I just want to interject. Is this where Tracy was going to be speaking?
This is where Tracy was going to be speaking. So, okay.
Sorry, everyone. We had another person, and Tracy unfortunately had a family emergency, and so I'm filling in. I did start a little bit of the background earlier that on the work that CCD has done over the last 40 years. I'm not going to go too much into this. You can find more information on our website, or you can reach out to any of our staff or council members or executives. Just a few highlights that have occurred over the past 4 decades. CCD has engaged in a range of activities in support of the achievement of the goals of deinstitutionalization, living in the community, true choice on community, availability of housing, and supports to live how one wishes. By working with the advancing our own reform agenda, collaboration with civil society organizations to improve access to housing, participating in public policy development processes, conducting research, engaging in international human rights monitoring process, and in litigation. And you'll hear about one of those litigation moments a little bit later in this presentation that CCD was supportive of. So we strongly believe that the government needs to reinforce and live up to the Accessible Canada Act and ensure that across the board, all areas of life are met with human rights and equality. And this includes the National Housing Strategy Act. We are looking forward to seeing the work of the committee that Michelle mentioned and how that's going to support moving forward with inclusion and accessibility. We also continue to do work internationally. As I mentioned earlier, we were part of the civil society group in the 2017 review of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, where we brought concerns forward on the situation for people with disabilities in housing, as well as other areas of concern for equality and the full inclusion and rights of people. So we did produce an information piece that's called On the Home Front: Poverty, Disability, Housing, and Help with Everyday Activities, which I recommend people look to and see, because I feel that in many ways we haven't moved forward in a lot of this research and work. Sorry. And I think I'm going to leave it at that. You know, there's been a lot of work CC has done in 40 years, but we continue to press for the rights of people with disabilities and the right to housing. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Jewel. So moving to the next part of our agenda, we're going to be talking today about a crucial human rights case that is currently being adjudicated in Nova Scotia, involving important aspects of the systemic violation of the right to housing and discrimination faced by persons with disabilities. I'm very much looking forward to hearing more from our three speakers, who I have the privilege of introducing to you all. Claire McNeil practices law at Dalhousie Legal Aid Service in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Among her current work, she represents the Disability Rights Coalition in a claim of systemic discrimination based on the province's unnecessary institutionalization of people with disabilities and deprivation of meaningful access to social assistance. She has also worked in Nepal, South Africa, and East Africa on projects aimed at realizing international human rights and access to justice. Vince Calderhead has been a lawyer since 1986. In 2017, he joined Pink Larkin, a union-side labor firm in Halifax, where he has a pro bono practice restricted to strategic anti-poverty litigation. Previously, he was a senior staff counsel at Nova Scotia Legal Aid in Halifax, where he litigated many social and economic rights cases since 1986. He has internationally recognized expertise in the area of economic, social, and cultural rights, and has represented anti-poverty groups before the United Nations treaty bodies on many occasions. And Victoria Levack is a 30-year-old disability rights advocate, chair of the Halifax Accessibility Advisory Committee, chair of the Nova Scotia League for Equal Opportunities, and member of the Nova Scotia Disability Rights Coalition. At the age of 21, after discussion with her family, Vicky made the tough decision to move into a long-term care facility. This is because the Nova Scotia government denied her application for supports and services to meet her needs in the community. As a result of that decision, Vicky is forced to live in a larger congregate care seniors facility with people often twice her age or more. Most of the people she lives with have some sort of cognitive delay, which makes it very hard to have meaningful conversations and create meaningful relationships. As a result, she often feels isolated and alone. However, she doesn't let that stop her from doing what she thinks is right and morally just. And she also enjoys bad movies, romance novels, and cheese, which incidentally I find very relatable. So I'll hand it over to our fantastic panel to tell you more about this case.
Hi everyone, my name is Vince Calderhead, and I'd like to begin by respectfully acknowledging that I live and work within Mi'kma'ki, the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We are going to proceed by way of kind of a question and answer thing. you don't need to worry, there aren't too many questions, but Claire will be kind of facilitating that. But before we do that, I wanted to give you just a very quick overview of the issues that we're grappling with and in particular, the human rights case that is now well underway. Let me start by saying for years as lawyers, Claire McNeil and I have been aware of a significant and increasingly atrocious situation of people with disabilities looking for and hoping to get community-based housing and supports and services. So it's about inclusion in community. Nova Scotia is by far the worst province in Canada in terms of relying on institutionalization of people with disabilities rather than providing supports and services to live in community. And with that background, in 2014, 3 individuals and a disability rights group, the Disability Rights Coalition, whom Claire represents, jointly filed a human rights complaint with the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission. And that resulted in a hearing, not within a few months, but a few years later, in particular in February of 2018, that is to say some 4 years later, the Human Rights Board of Inquiry proceeding got underway, and it continued in different phases through and into 2019. In March of 2019, the Board of Inquiry rendered a decision essentially upholding the fact that it was discrimination by the government to fail to provide supports and services for people with disabilities to be included in and live in community. So upheld 3 individual complaints while dismissing the systemic complaint. And so what that meant practically was that 3 individuals were allowed to succeed, but the larger group, and at this point, the larger group represents over 1,600 people, but everyone knows there are far more who have simply given up. And so the Board of Inquiry dismissed that. That resulted in a whole bunch of appeals by the Disability Rights Coalition, by the individuals, by the province. There was a bit of a Donnybrook of appeals. And as the appeals were getting set to be heard, 3 national disability rights groups intervened. So that's Inclusion Canada, CCD, and People First. And they were represented by the Public Interest Law Center in Winnipeg. All of the appeals were heard over 2 days on November 18th and 19th, when the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal really heard about the situation of people with disabilities and the rights that we're claiming, the rights for substantive equality, the rights for community inclusion, and asking the court to render a very strong decision in that regard. So that's kind of the background and overview of the case. And maybe from there, I'll turn it over to Claire for to get things rolling on our individual perspectives.
Thanks for that background and overview of what we're here to talk about today, Vince. The plan is that I'm just going to pose 3 pretty simple questions, and then we're each going to take a turn from our different perspectives of giving our take on this case. And hopefully it'll be helpful to people, not just to learn more about our case, but just the process that we went through in dealing with an issue of systemic discrimination that affected people in Nova Scotia, people with disabilities in Nova Scotia, because there may be other issues or other scenarios happening elsewhere where you're facing similar challenges. So the first question that I'm going to pose to all 3 of us is, how did you become involved with this issue and the discrimination case? And first of all, I'm going to turn it over to Vicky to talk a little bit from her personal perspective about how she became involved with this issue and the human rights claim that the Disability Rights Coalition has brought. Vicky?
Thank you, Claire. As I said, my name is Victoria Levack, and I got in this sort of because I had no choice. In 2018, when I turned 18, which was in 2008, pardon me, I went to university, got accepted. We thought I didn't need 24-hour care, so we applied for the self-managed care program for me. It turned out I needed way more care than that, and I almost died. So I got out of school because dying is bad, and after some treatment at the Nova Scotia rehab, which literally saved my life, after 6 weeks there, I moved back home. We then applied to get me into the Department of Community Services program for a small options home. But when they did the assessment, they decided I was not eligible for one reason or another that I don't understand. They said my needs were simply too high. And we were really upset about that. So we were like, okay, now what? And they basically said, you have two options, which weren't really options. Stay with your parents until they're dead, and then move into a nursing home anyway, or move into a nursing home now. I lived in a very small town with no job opportunities, and all my friends were in the city here in Halifax. And I knew if I wanted to get a good job, specifically with disabilities, tones, I knew all at least the Nova Scotia chapters of organizations are all based in Halifax, well, for the most part. So I decided to move into Upperstone because it was the only young adult facility in the province, and that's where I am now. However, young adult to our Nova Scotia Health Department means anybody 18 to 64. So many of the people I live with, as previously stated, are cognitively delayed. The average age of the score is about, cognitive age is about 10. So it's making it very hard to form, friendships, and a lot of people are really angry. So I sort of just keep to myself, which makes me lonely, but it's also safer because I have been punched, I have been scratched, I almost was sexually assaulted. So I'm here and fighting for this because I have no choice. If I want to live the way I want to live, I have to fight.
Thanks for that, Vicky. Vince, did you want to comment on how you became involved? I know you've given a bit of an introduction already to the case, but is there anything else you wanted to say?
But maybe just in particular, as a local legal aid lawyer, human rights lawyer, I had a kind of overall appreciation of the enormous struggles that people with disabilities had been experiencing in terms of trying to get community-based housing and supports and services. And then in 2000, I'm going to say 12, a social worker from the Nova Scotia Hospital contacted us and said, kind of acting in the role of a whistleblower, said, we have a whole bunch of people on our unit who don't need to be here for any medical or legal reason at all. And I'm going to arrange a meeting of people who are living here and then family members. And I'm wondering whether, she asked us whether we might be interested in representing some of the people. So we kind of had an open-ended meeting. And she, at that time or shortly thereafter, provided us with a report that had been prepared by outside experts outside the province, saying that what was happening on that unit at the hospital was a complete human rights outrage. And so things kind of moved from there, unfortunately, very, very slowly. But that's how we got going. And within a few months, we had decided that we would pursue the human rights of several of the people. And in the end, I represented 3 individual people who had been for years on the unit. 2 of the 3 had lived successfully in the community, but then became ill and ended up in the black hole of Emerald Hall, where people enter, but really they can't leave. And I had one client who, one of the 3 who had been admitted there in the year 2000. And when we looked at filing the complaint in 2014, had been living in the unit, an acute care psychiatric unit, for 14 years, completely unnecessarily, no medical or legal reason for her to be there whatsoever.
I'm just going to say a couple of things as well in answer to my own question about how I became involved. And I too, like Vince, have worked in legal aid for many, many years. And what we saw was in the late 1990s, early 2000s, more and more people started coming to us looking for help, legal help, because they weren't able to get their basic needs met. And some of them articulated those needs as the need for supportive housing. In other cases, it came up differently. There was some adult protection cases where people were unhappy with being forced to leave their home community in order to be housed, and unhappy with being forced into institutions in those situations. And so the court was responsible for deciding what was in people's best interest. But there was a common thread, whether it was seen as a supportive housing issue, sometimes it was seen as being a special needs issue to do with social assistance, or whether it was an adult protection issue. It all involved people with disabilities who had some needs, some different needs for supports and services in order to live in community. And so it didn't present itself as a human rights problem. That was something that came with time, that we realized that a lot of these other legal avenues didn't offer any kind of options to deal with the root problem or the systemic problem. And so that's why we kind of focused in on the issue of human rights. And I think it's really graphically, you can see it in Vicky's own story, because she says, I don't really know why they denied me access to services. And really it was because the system of social assistance we have here in Nova Scotia was designed with the able-bodied person in mind. And because of her disability, it was actually because of Vicky's different needs that she was found to be ineligible for social assistance. So in a way, it's almost kind of a direct form of discrimination at work that we see here in Nova Scotia. I don't know what it's like elsewhere, but it had systemic implications. It had nothing to do with Vicky as an individual, or obviously it impacted her dignity and everything else, but it didn't have any, it was not an individual personal decision. It was just across the board. This was the result of government action, and mostly inaction, in ensuring that the system was accommodative of people with disabilities and their different needs. So the move towards a human rights framework came over time, because that wasn't initially how the problem presented itself to us. So I'm going to move on now to a second fairly simple question. And again, Vicky, I'm going to call on you to respond first, if you wouldn't mind, to this second question, and that is, if you could just comment for us on, for you, what's at stake in this appeal.
Oh, I'm already unmuted. Okay. Sorry, I thought I was on mute. What's at stake? My dignity as a human, my right to be a member of my own society, my right to liberty, to actual adulthood. Because right now where I live, there are many, many, many rules that are set for people with cognitive delays that do not apply to me because I do not have a cognitive delay. Excuse me. And so I'm not even a real adult because there's some choices that have been taken away from me. I don't choose what I eat. I don't choose what I get to eat. Yeah, I don't get to choose because of COVID, even though I understand all the restrictions. I am not allowed to leave my house without my father present. Because the rules say that a designated support person has to be with you at all times. Because of COVID and following restrictions, I know how to follow restrictions. I understand why they're necessary, and yet they're still making me go out with my father. I'm 30 years old. If I want to go get a coffee at Starbucks, I have to call my daddy. That's like not kind of, it is insulting. And I don't like to think about it very much because it just makes me angry. I have so much rage inside me that it's scary at times. Because I have no way to let it out. So what this takes for me really is my humanity. And I just want my humanity, please. And I want a home. That's it.
Wow, thank you, Vicky. I think we're all just trying to process that. Vince, did you have something you wanted to come in on with that, in terms of what's at stake in this appeal?
I mean, for my 3 individual clients, it's about their right to community inclusion. In Nova Scotia, the Disability Supports Program is located, or is one aspect of social assistance. And so at a macro level, really what this is about is whether people with disabilities can enjoy social assistance in the same way as people without disabilities. And by the same way, I mean the right to live in community as opposed to institutionalization, the right to live as an autonomous adult rather than be infantilized by being forced to live in your parents' home. And it's inclusion obviously includes the province taking into account differential needs. So at some overriding level, it's about equality. And that's exactly the case for my individual clients as well. And because it needs to be understood that there's nothing unique about their cases are emblematic of the overriding and systemic problem. The only other thing I would mention, and perhaps I ought to have said this earlier, is that the way people with disabilities are treated when they're looking to the province for supports is reminiscent of kind of the 18th century poorhouse idea, where very early on, everyone who was in need of assistance from government was required to live in a congregate poorhouse setting. And in the very traditional Nova Scotia, that was only gotten rid of in the 50s and even up into the 60s. The problem here is that everyone else has been let out of the poorhouse and is assisted in the community, except people with disabilities who need, whose needs are extensive. They are required to live in an institution. And so from a historical point of view, that's kind of what's at stake here, whether they'll be not just allowed out of the poorhouse, but as importantly, ensured that they have the supports and services to enjoy community inclusion.
Thanks, Vince. I'm just going to comment on that from the perspective of the Disability Rights Coalition and its claim, which was based on a claim of systemic discrimination, which means that it wasn't focused on any individual circumstances. It was looking at the cumulative effect of years and years of government action and inaction that resulted in what is currently a 1,600 person wait list, even for the supports and services that are in existence. And then there's many, probably many others who are not even on that wait list because they've been discouraged from applying. So there's that's the challenge for the coalition, is that as a result of the Board of Inquiry decision, the board found that the individuals had been discriminated against. Again, his findings were not because of any individual issue that they presented, but because of you know, the government's overarching policies and practices that, you know, is the essence of systemic discrimination. And despite that, dismissed the complaint of systemic discrimination. In doing so, said people can apply, people with disabilities can come one by one and make their applications, and they'll be determined and adjudicated on a one-by-one basis by the you know, future human rights boards of inquiry. And the, you know, that is a very concerning outcome of this case so far, because when we look at the capacity of our human rights in this province, it's quite limited. You know, we've got their lead counsel recently in the news saying that they have very limited resources. They hold about 3 or 4 hearings a year maximum. So when we've got 1,600 people on the wait list or more, when and if these cases, and also we don't have an automatic right to it, people don't have an automatic right to a hearing. There's a gatekeeper function that's performed by our commission, and so they can refuse, and they do refuse to hear, to schedule or to refer matters for hearing. So the outcome really presents a whole other level of access to justice issues for people with disabilities in Nova Scotia if it's allowed to stand. So, you know, on the substantive issue of unnecessary institutionalization in Nova Scotia, so for people and everybody who's been assessed as eligible for this program and who's on the wait list has been assessed as capable of living in the community. So that's really not an issue. Vince identified that was the case for his 3 individual clients, that they weren't in the hospital because of any needs that they had. It was because of the failure of the system to provide community-based supports and services. So the case isn't really about deinstitutionalization. It's often characterized like that. And it is true that we take the position that the institutionalization that's going on right now in Nova Scotia of people with disabilities by virtue of the fact that they have a disability is discrimination. But it's not enough. If we were to close all those institutions tomorrow, that could have drastic outcomes if the government doesn't step up and provide the access, meaningful access to the supports and services in the community that people need. And so it's really importantly a case that's been about social assistance. And despite the fact that I mentioned earlier that people in the early stages identified housing as the challenge, because of the really pitiful and woeful state of public housing and government-supported housing in this province, it really didn't offer us any kind of realistic remedy in that direction. We had to look because the group that we represent are all people who are eligible for social assistance or living in poverty. That was the focus. And the other part of it was certainly when we started out on this, and I think things have really in the last 20 years moved in a very positive direction with the Convention of the Rights of People with Disabilities, and more thinking about this notion of the right to housing to make that a more inclusive concept, so that we're not talking about bricks and mortar, we're not just talking about affordability, we're talking about true inclusion. Because the facts in our case are that the housing portion, you know, if you're thinking of housing just being bricks and mortar, is a tiny percentage of what people with disabilities need to live in the community. It's mostly human resources, frankly. It's mostly supports and services that people need. And so, and for good or bad, maybe it was originally an overly restrictive, concept of housing. Housing didn't seem to capture the full essence of what people's needs were. And so that'll be the challenge as we look at the National Housing Strategy, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, but to kind of make sure that we resist the ableist kind of understanding of what the right to housing means. So I have a final question that we were going to pose, and I hope we're not running over our time at this point. And it's really about where we go from here in terms of this case in fighting for community inclusion and against institutionalization in Nova Scotia. And so I'm going to turn it over to Vicky to start, just to hear from her as to what she thinks might be some other things that we can do. We're obviously fighting it in the courts, but what else is needed in order to move this issue forward?
I think what is needed to move this issue forward is political will. People, not just in the government, but the citizens, have to be able and willing to make this an issue. We can't just fight for ourselves. We need help. We disabled people can yell about our human rights till we're blue in the face, but if there aren't quote unquote normal people to back us up, we're not going anywhere. Nothing will happen because there's more of the neurotypical able-bodied population than there is us. So until the government happens to give a crap, or the citizens and their other constituents give a crap about people with disabilities, we can't get anything done. Now, I know it's COVID, so protesting is probably outside isn't a good thing right now. But when I saw the Black Lives Matter movement, I was like, why aren't we doing one of these on like a massive scale? Because I guarantee you, if we had a thing the size of the Black Lives Matter movement for disability rights, they'd be putting stuff through so fast and making heads spin. So political will and power and the willingness to see us as human beings, because right now I don't think my government looks at me as a human being. I think they look at me as a problem and something to be fixed, and that's not the case. That's it.
Thanks, Vicky. Vince, did you want to speak to that?
Just very quickly, we obviously will continue litigating our human rights case through the courts here and the courts in Ottawa if need be. And if that doesn't work out, then we need to look at the optional protocol under the CRPD to bring our accountability mechanisms to the international level And then within Canada, obviously the National Housing Strategy Act mechanisms are something we would need to look at as well.
And I think that means we're out of time, so I'm going to save any other comments for perhaps maybe for the questions at the end. But thank you all very much for making this opportunity for us to speak about this case here in Nova Scotia, and look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thanks, Claire. And just a big thank you to the panelists for that very informative and at times very moving presentation, and in particular to Vicky for speaking frankly and from the heart. Again, we'll have an opportunity to take questions and have a discussion at the end. And I'm going to shift gears and introduce our next speaker, who is Jewel Smith, and is going to speak to us about challenges facing women with disabilities with intersectional issues of marginalization in accessing housing, as well as the international framework of rights for persons with disabilities under the CRPD. Jewel is a strong voice for human rights in Canada. She's a feminist disability activist, scholar, writer, and artist. She's received training in human rights monitoring, women's human rights justice, and methods in using legislation, policy, and human rights treaties to challenge inequality. She's a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia Okanagan campus, and her dissertation documents the experiences of disabled mothers in Canada from a human rights perspective. She's the former chairperson of the Council of Canadians with Disabilities from 2016 until 2020, and she's an advisor of the board of directors for the National Educational Association of Disabled Students. Over to you, Jewel.
Thank you. Next slide. Okay, so I just first want to acknowledge my, I'm going to be speaking about my PhD research, which I'm just completing right now and hoping to defend in the spring. I want to acknowledge my PhD committee, which is Dr. Rochelle Hole, Dr. Tim Staten, and Dr. Leighton Schnellert for all of their guidance and assistance. So I'm going to be talking specifically about the experiences of disabled mothers in Ontario and British Columbia, which are the two provinces that I recruited participants from, which I interviewed a total of 18 women in those two provinces. They were all over the age of 19. They identified as having a disability, had at least one child under the age of 19, and shared either partial or full custody of at least one child. I conducted the interviews June to December 2019, and I used a modified methodology combining Disability Rights Promotion International and life course history methods. And I'm just going to, because I'm going to speak about it in a little bit, I want to highlight that I had 8 participants from urban centers, 6 from suburban, and 4 who were rural or remote. And I think that that's particularly important. Just a little bit about why I did this research. Myself, I'm disabled, and I raised my 2 sons who are now adults and living independently. I experienced a lot of discrimination raising my children. I also, particular to this topic, I experienced a lot of issues around housing myself, and I felt like when my children were grown that I was in a safe place to challenge the discrimination we all experience and not fear the risk of losing custody of my child because my children because I was speaking out. So first, I also want to talk a little bit about some of the assumptions made about disability result in the discriminations that are made to people who are parents who are disabled. We're very much invisible in conversations. More often than not, there's assumptions that disabled people don't have children, they don't have families. When you look at the complexity of housing, often housing units are built assuming that parents are able-bodied or caregivers are able-bodied and that one disabled person lives within a household. And this can be very problematic when you're looking for affordable, accessible housing that is government run or government funded, or even just in general. Next slide. So I'm not going to read this slide out in particular, but I just want to highlight this is from the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It's Article 19, which is the particular article that talks about the right to housing and the right to live independently with choices in the community. This is very much intersected for me in my research with Article 23, which is the right to have a family, the right to have relationship, the right to have and raise your children or adopt children, which was the larger part of my study. I framed my research very much embedded in human rights. And I started my research before we had a strategy nationally that acknowledged housing as a human right, because I've always believed that it's a human right. And I think that the issue for so many people is that people with disabilities are assumed to be recipients of charity or recipients of medical and rehabilitation services and not as full human beings with rights within the community. Next slide. So this idea of choice, I know Vicky touched on it. It's really problematic in that we're often told we have choices, except the choices are pretty terrible for the most part, whether you're a single person or a person who's raising children. Often people are forced to weigh what their needs are versus what resources they have, what is their socioeconomic status. So things like location, access to transportation, the services that might be necessary to live your life fully, accessibility itself within your home and community, and affordability are some of the things that are weighed out by parents. So next slide. So in this next section, I'm going to move through a series of quotes that I heard from the women who participated in my study. It's very important to me to privilege their stories and to highlight their voices. They tell their own stories and I'm just amplifying them and putting them in the context of human rights and the barriers and discrimination experienced by our community. So this first one, I had a number of mothers who talked about purposefully building their homes. And this was very much in the context of people who had the resources to build their own home, but then also weighing other parts of what it is to purposefully build your home and where can you afford to do that. So just for everybody to know, I've changed the names of the participants. These are pseudonyms that I've created. I'm just providing a little bit of information on each of the quotes. So Selena, who is low vision and has 3 children, said, "Our home was purpose built. We built our house. We built it with all our needs in mind. But I would say my specific needs most in mind. Lighting that we could adjust, blinds that could be adjusted for a darker room, TVs on the wall that are closer to couches. We were very intentional about adopting the environment for me, and we had the luxury of being able to build a house, so we did it." So Selena has a partner. They both have full-time careers, and they were able to plan and build their home. But as we know, often that's not the case. Next slide. Oh, back one. Yeah. So Heather, who has a learning disability and an autoimmune condition, and she has one child with a physical disability, also built her own home. She said, "I mean, the sheer fact that the reason why I live here is because it affords me this house, and this house is amazingly accessible because I built it from scratch and I designed it myself, and it's huge and I can afford it because we live in the middle of nowhere. If we lived downtown in a large city, would it be more accessible? Yeah, but could I afford this house? No. Then we would be in a shoebox, which would be less accessible. We would be living in a shoebox. Usually it's either your home is accessible or your city is accessible. Like everything is a trade-off. Honestly, like this house, I mean, just for the bathroom I have for my daughter, it's worth living here just for that bathroom. You wouldn't get that bathroom in the city." So this is an example of someone choosing to live far out in the country where she has to own her own accessible vehicle because there is no transportation, public transportation available to her. She has to travel for all the services for herself and her daughter to treat their disabilities medically or to reach out for any other services. But for her, the trade-off was worth it. And she's also, I just want to mention that Heather is single, but she had an enormous supportive family that has helped her to create this accessible space. Next slide, next slide. So accessibility versus affordability. This is a topic that came up all the time with the women that I interviewed. Many of them who did finally get into affordable public housing of some sort had to be on wait lists for a long time. Others had to make choices about accessibility versus affordability. So Diane, who lives with fibromyalgia and a mental health diagnosis, has one child. And she said, I had this occupational therapist come to my house, and this was the affordable house that we lived in. And she said, sorry, I can't make this house work for you. You're going to just have to move. There's no way we can make this house work for you. It was 100 steps from my car into the unit. And she's like, those are the 100 steps that you can't do. And this is not working. It sucked that her advice was so dramatic, but at the same time, it was the right advice. I'm doing so much better. When we first moved in, I was using the walker, and now I don't even need my cane. I don't even think about it. I think that says a lot about living with a chronic health condition. Next slide. So actually, I just want to finish with Diane. So she made those choices about living in an affordable home, but as you saw, her condition improved. And for many people who live with chronic and episodic conditions, living in an accessible home can mean all the difference to our health. And not having to do multiple steps or stairs is such a difference. But for her, it meant that she had a trade-off, and she had to be using the food bank, and it was quite a difficult and abrupt change. So Heather said, so I had to move. That was a big expense. It's still a big expense that has had to happen. I mean, I was in an affordable place, but it was not accessible. I had to move out into a building that is accessible. I think that I'm doing as well as I am because, for example, the handles for the doors are hooks, so I don't have to turn the knobs. I hate turning knobs, opening jars, all those things I just can't do. So I definitely think this house has improved my accessibility a lot, but it costs $350 more per month than the affordable place that I was living in previously. It's accessible, but it's less affordable. And so bring you back to that conversation about choice. I mean, truly, is this a choice? She's $350 more a month she has to come up with on a fixed income, but she has accessibility. So again, this is something that I don't think is thought out a lot of when we talk about what is true choice and living independently in the community. Next slide. So I just want to note creativity, and I think it's important to really recognize the resilience and creativity of the community always in figuring out ways to adapt and to live as well and a life as possible. I just want to share also that so many of the participants in the study really have great senses of humor. You know, they would laugh about the accommodations they sorted out and the ways that they would manage. And I mean, yes, it's a coping skill, but it also really speaks to our resiliency. So Maya had so many examples, but I just pulled this one. When we were talking about accessibility and housing, she said, it's not great. It's more accessible than the last place I lived, which was in a basement. You can bring a wheelchair inside my house. There are no door openers to the doors on the outside, so that's been a pain in my ass. The bathroom isn't accessible at all, and neither is the kitchen. So technically you can bring your wheelchair in, but you can't use it in the house in any kind of way. So I generally kind of get around by holding onto the walls or using a walker or a cane. She also talked about when her son was a little bit smaller, using his toys, his ride-em toys to get around the house, which is terrible, but it's also creative. And she has managed, and this got her out of a basement, which was fully inaccessible, to a place where she can at least manage and care for her child. Next slide. So I just want to talk a little bit about what is the cost of inaccessibility. And I mentioned it a little bit earlier in that, a person's health can be affected by an inaccessible home to such an extent that it worsens the condition. I was really struck by Frida's conversation with me about her housing. She has autism spectrum disorder, POTS, and a mobility disability, and she has 3 children that she's raising. She said, there's stairs, it's 900 square foot split level, the tiniest, most cramped kitchen. I had a complete breakdown last week because I finally had to reconcile myself to the fact that I'm not getting anything out of the lower cupboards anymore. I can't bend at that angle anymore. I cannot do these things. I cannot lift those things that awkward way, and it brings me to tears, so I quit. So when we think about the accessibility needs of people, there are so many parts of it that make for a full life. So Frida is, she was really distraught, and we actually took a break after this conversation, because for her, not being able to prepare food for her children and having to ask for help really takes away from her independence. And it's been very frustrating for her. And this is the cost of living in an inaccessible home. Next slide. So, oh, there's my dog. So negotiating disability to meet needs. I found this really interesting, and this was something that came up in various aspects of accessing services or housing or whatever. But Rhea, who's blind and is diagnosed with a mental health condition, has 2 children. And she talked about how she got access to affordable, accessible housing. So from the public housing. She said, so I applied, I played it up a little bit. It was true, really, single mom, and I was blind. It was only a year and a half, and then I got in. I was really lucky. I got into a 3-bedroom. It's pretty nice, relatively speaking, and it's close to the bus route, which is really important to me. So Rhea was really clear that she had to play up her disability, but she also had to balance this with not looking like she wasn't able to take care of her children, but just play it up enough so that she wouldn't be on the typical 5 to 7 year wait list that happens in BC when you need a 2 or a 3-bedroom accessible, affordable home. Next line, or sorry, next slide. I'm used to using dragon, so I always say next line. So I just want to, before I get into the kind of just my overview of these things, there's some real concerns that disabled mothers face. Rhea's example is one of them. This balance between letting folks know what your needs are with your disability, but not in such a way that they will assume you can't parent. And this is a real fear. Mothers with disabilities lose custody of their children or face over surveillance all the time. Mothers who are going through divorce, who have a disability and an able-bodied ex-partner, often lose custody because judges assume that an able-bodied parent is better than a disabled parent. And there was a number of examples in my research that demonstrated this with women who temporarily lost custody or still, continue to fight or shared custody because of their disability. There's also, there's just a fear of being too disabled or not disabled enough to access the housing that they need. I just want to say, I think that there was one slide that went missing. I had one other quote though I want to share before I go into this, this final little section. The right to love and relationships. So in British Columbia specifically, if you are on disability provincial benefits and you move in with a partner who is able-bodied or even a disabled partner, you will lose your benefits or your benefits will go down. You'll have less money coming in. And sometimes you might lose other benefits and services that you have. And so I did hear from a couple of the mothers that I interviewed that they had to make really hard choices about not living with partners and not move, like just not moving in together and not sharing space. So Gail, who lives with autism spectrum disorder, fibromyalgia, and a mental health diagnosis and has 1 child, said, and if we moved in together, then we both would lose money off of our disability. So we're keeping both places. So they have to navigate traveling between 2 homes, raising their child. And I repeatedly have heard from this in other research I've done that this is very problematic. That if you want to have a relationship, there's this further barrier to your right to find love and to build a home with somebody. So just kind of I have a couple more points before the end, but I just wanted to highlight the National Housing Act and the strategy. I think are really important steps, and it's really incumbent on the community to keep an eye on these and to really put pressure on the government to meet the expectations of housing as a right for people with disabilities, with diverse families, and diverse needs. It's really important as well because we live in a federation that we monitor the provincial policies and look for discriminatory practices in these, and that we challenge them as well, and that we continue the research on these particular areas, and that we make sure they align with the international treaties we sign, the Federal Accessible Canada Act, and the Housing Act specifically for this topic. And we make sure that they're aligning. I also just want to highlight practice. So the fact is that even though we have these laws in place, so many judges, social workers, hospitals, you know, other support and care workers make assumptions about what parenting should look like, what mothering specifically should look like. And so many of the women talked about being over-surveilled because what it looks like to mother when you live with a disability can be quite different than what it looks like for an able-bodied person to parent. There certainly are no jokes when you're disabled about, you know, joking about, you know, dropping your kid, or like I see all kinds of things that able-bodied women joke about online, and this does not happen in our community. Often women are afraid to ask for help if they're struggling. And when they do, instead of being met with solutions, they're often met with, you know, oh, perhaps you shouldn't have a child. Perhaps your child should be in foster care. And this is extremely problematic. And I just want to flag that I think it's a real area that we need to do better in Canada on. Final slide. So my recommendations: more research on affordable, accessible, safe housing for diverse family structures. We need explicit language in the Housing Act. I know the strategy talks about human rights, but the actual Housing Act does not talk about accessibility and disability needs. I think we need to challenge government to have language on accessibility in their federal, provincial, territorial agreements when they're transferring funds around housing. We need a lot more education. People going through the system and becoming the professionals that support, you know, the needs of our community need to have better education on you know, checking their ableism. As Vicky said, you know, if we had a disability rights, you know, march going on, maybe they'd pay attention. But I think it really starts with education and people considering what are their ableist views before they start working with our community. I strongly believe, and so many of you heard me say this, all publicly funded housing should be built with universal design principles. Enough of giving us 10% or 20% of accessibility when something is publicly funded. It all, from the ground up, should be built that way. And we need to continue to use human rights principles in housing policy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jules, and thank you as well, Vince and Vicky and Claire. I think we're moving on now to the question and answer portion, but just before we do, I just wanted to say what excellent presentations. I've heard you all speak differently in different places before, but holy, that was some really interesting and I think kind of exciting information. There's quite a few questions coming in. I'm very happy to report, so I'm just going to start us going through those. We have about 15 minutes for questions, just to flag for our panelists. If folks have other questions, please feel free to type them into the question and answer box, and we will do what we can to try to get through all of these in the next 15 minutes. So why don't I just start, one comment that came in earlier, but I think, Jules, this is probably targeted towards you because it's speaking to British Columbia housing and in fact, the gap of 24/7 support for persons with disabilities. So I'll read you the question, maybe give you a chance to reflect on this a bit. So hello, I am in BC. As I'm sure you are aware, there is much creative work being done with respect to community living. However, a person who has an intellectual disability plus has physical support needs and requires 24/7 support, housing is relegated to group homes because it's the only option if a person or their family does not own property. BC housing is available, but it's not to those who require 24/7 support. So Jules, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this based on your work that you'd like to reflect on some of the gaps that you might see in your work.
I agree, and I've heard this. It's not specific to the research that I've been conducting, but many of my colleagues here in BC have spoke about this, and you know, I don't understand it because we can do better. We know how to do better, and it's very frustrating to me when I talk to friends and colleagues, especially during COVID, when living in these situations has become so much more problematic than it already was. But I agree that not having other options is not okay. I know that particular to mothers, I know that there are options in both provinces for things like in Ontario, it's called nurture care, for example, where you have 24/7 support to assist in your parenting duties alone. And I just don't understand why those sorts of programs couldn't be extended to include all disabilities, whether or not you have children or a partner or live alone. Thanks.
Thank you, Jules, for that. Right before we go in, I have a couple of other questions for all of the panelists, but one of our participants is hoping to ask a question through audio. Debbie, are you able to unmute Mark so he can ask his question? We'll give this one moment.
Yes, I unmuted Mark, so go ahead, Mark.
Okay, first of all, I want to say to everybody, thank you so much. And Jules, you're just the fact that you are speaking up now, and the fact that you're a fellow artist with a disability is awesome. So, and to the woman that's unfortunately in the nursing home, for lack of a better word, I completely sympathize with you. I agree with you. And I live in Ontario, and I've spoken to some people about this, but I've been fighting with my landlord, who used to be my care provider. They've been trying to kick me out for 3 years because they terminated my services because they tried to suspend them, which is obviously illegal. And one of the reasons for suspension was for reaching out to politicians about some stuff that's going on around here. And they've threatened me with a lawsuit for slander and libel because I did a course called Social Justice Speaker School here in Ontario, and it's inspired me to get into this work. Activism is a job, and I'm learning and developing my own skills, and I can relate to I forget your name, I apologize. I can relate to the person that lives in the nursing home due to the fact, like, I have a learning disability, but I consider myself smart as long as I have certain tools to get done what I need to get done. And even technology that people use doesn't work with me too well with my brain. I'm better having people, like, if I direct them on how to do something, that's great. But my question is, what do we do, not only for my case, but for other people's cases? Because I completely agree with Jules that it starts with education, and I also completely agree with the other person, anybody else that has said, if we raised our voices like Black Lives Matter. I completely agree. There's a movie on Netflix called Crip Camp that speaks about that in the States, and it happened. People with disabilities occupied a building for 3 days, 20 days, something like that. So yes, I'm coming to you both as a victim, but also as an advocate, and I'm emotionally going to be asking, like, what do we do, not just for me, but for the other person out there in Halifax and other people in Ontario that are scared to speak up about their care needs not being met from their supportive living home, or their landlord and tenant board rights not being respected, but yet housing law is different than human rights law. And with the human rights system in Ontario, you only get a lawyer once you get to a certain point, and you get advice on what to do. But with me, because I didn't have the skills at the time to do it, I just spoke from the heart, and they said, but you didn't explain how they're discriminating against you. And it's like, because I spoke up about my needs not being met as a tenant, or with my care, or being picked on and being asked inappropriate questions as a member of the LGBTQ plus community, which that's a whole nother ball of wax. We as people with disabilities aren't seen as sexual beings. We're not, like everybody said, we're not seen as humans still, and it's pathetic. And what do we do?
That's a great question, Mark. I'm so glad you voiced that. Maybe we can ask our panelists to speak up about that. What do you do? What do you do when speaking about your rights? Sometimes there can be repercussions for that. I'm curious to hear from all of our panelists on that question.
I'll jump in, not to take away anybody else. Thank you, Mark. There was a lot packed in there to your overview of the situation that you face. And I don't have any simple answers, but what I would say is in this province, when people were getting very frustrated with the situation that they faced and the inaction by government, they organized. And so we do have a pretty strong coalition now. There's many sort of disability groups that are focused on addressing specific issues in relation to specific disabilities, but the Disability Rights Coalition really formed to be a sort of pan-disability, anybody who wants to join can, and it's really focused on strength in numbers so that you're not, singled out as being the person who's asking the hard questions, that you can speak from a position of some, and Vicky could speak to this as well, of some power, in the sense that you were part of a larger group. So I know that community organizing has been helpful across a range of issues, not just the one that we're talking about here today in terms of the human rights issue. I would just note too, for people who are interested in learning more about the case or about the Disability Rights Coalition, there's a pretty good website that you can access. It's just Google Disability Rights Coalition Nova Scotia, and you should be able to find it. And there's a lot of material there, a lot of the documents in relation to the claim in Nova Scotia, and the sort of the legal grounds and so forth. And as well, just general information about what's going on here in the province and so forth in terms of disability. So.
I'm not sure if Vicky was going to go, but I could go right now. So I did mention in my presentation that the reason I chose this particular topic and focus for my PhD is because I'm no longer vulnerable to losing custody of my children, and that's particularly why I was able to do that. I would have never taken it on before, although I did take on other human rights specific to access to education and such. And it's to me all about balancing and what becomes the breaking point when you just can no longer be silent about a topic. I also suggest you reach out to the Council of Canadians with Disabilities. With regard to organizing, we have provincial groups, and we do in Ontario as well, that perhaps can support and help to join that coalition building and activism, because it's so important.
Vicky, would you like to speak to that question?
Yes, I would. I'm a little bit of a, for lack of a better word, shit disturber, pardon my language. So what I would do, if I were you, is contact every single media outlet in the entire province that you can get your hands on and try to get an interview. Or, that would be my first step. If you already discussed it with the government or with powers that make those decisions and they've said no, and you've given them multiple opportunities to correct that mistake, it is time to, as my father says, go nuclear. And that is when you no longer care about the consequences. You have to be mean. Don't start being mean, but if they're constantly saying no and that's something you really want, be prepared to not be everybody's favorite person and be prepared for those consequences, because that's all you have left to you. So that's what I would do.
Thank you, Vicky. That's a great answer. Oh, Vince, did you want to add something in? I just saw you.
Maybe, I think I agree with all of what Jules has said, and Vicky and Claire. Organization is super key. And the use of media, absolutely important. I would add, though, that many of us have struggled for human rights for so many years, and by that I'm referring to getting their protection in legislation and other means. And so when we live in a society where people with disabilities are pervasively discriminated against. I think that the failure by governments to take appropriate action to ensure inclusion, I think human rights mechanisms, whether it's human rights or the Charter of Rights or other related legal procedures, I think we need to hold governments accountable and society accountable. And not always, but quite often, that can be a method.
Excellent. Thank you, Vince. I'm just looking at our time. We have 3 minutes left. I'm going to say I see that there's some excellent questions pouring in through the question and answer box. I wish we had time to go through all of them. For folks who have joined this webinar, you have my email because you would have gotten the confirmation. So please feel free to connect and we can continue this discussion. I am going to say, I think this is the start of many conversations. And in fact, the National Housing Strategy Act and the council and the advocate and this building and coalition building stuff we're doing is, I think, the start of some pretty spectacular collaborative work together. So I will commit here, certainly on behalf of the National Right to Housing Network, that moving forward, we will be doing everything we can to be building those coalitions, supporting the work of our partners, and making sure that the rights of persons with disabilities are integrally understood in the way that we are interpreting and using the National Housing Strategy Act. So what I'm going to do, we have 2 minutes left. I'm going to give our panelists last word, and I'm going to see how quickly folks can answer this question, or maybe there's just one who will jump up and ask. And this is one of my favorite questions that's come up. Is there a legal mechanism to address or join the political and budgetary aspects of the cases? Is there a legal mechanism, human rights mechanism that we can use to address the gaps that we see in funding, the gaps that we see in budgetary allocations that we know are necessary to move forward these rights?
I think that's I'm just going to say that's a real hard one. Litigation isn't really used against government budgets at budget time, but invariably budget and fiscal appropriations and allocations come up and often dominate litigation of individual or systemic cases.
I just would like to note with regard to budget specifically is there's always an opportunity provincially to get your voice in when the budgets are being considered. There's usually a call out for people to put your name forward to, I mean, when it's not COVID time, you would physically attend an event at a location near you. And that's very much an opportunity to get your voice in. I'm sure this next round coming up, there'll be opportunities via Zoom. But that's one place where you can make sure that you're heard. You can also write to your governments and demand action and demand accountability on accessibility and housing as well. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That was a challenge. I will also add in that with the National Housing Strategy Act, with it being the articulation of the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, I'm curious to see how we will be tackling questions of things like a maximum of available resources and the fact that the federal government, and in fact all levels of government, have an obligation to be putting forward a maximum of available resources to meet their human rights obligations related to the right to housing. So I will close us up on that note. Thank you so sincerely to our speakers, to our incredible interpreters, to the folks who joined us today. We will have a recording of this webinar. And as I say, this is the start of many very long conversations about how we can do this incredibly exciting collaborative work. So we'll wrap up there. Thank you everyone so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.